quite intriguing.
Absolutely. And well, we're also going to be reviewing what has been a highlight for you on the week. Whatever stories that maybe have stood out for you. Is it the surge in numbers that we continue to see? Remember, as the president opened up the counties, one of the caveats, if I can call it that, he put is that within 21 days, we would be reviewing to see whether we have a huge number of COVID-19 positive cases. That seems to be the case. So are we staring at a lockdown that should be coming soon, or not? We also have been having a lot of political intrigues, particularly with the Senate, with the Budget Appropriation Committee giving their direction in that. But also we've been seeing a lot of wrangling between, or rather, committee changing hands in terms of the committee members. So those are some of the things that we'll be discussing right here as we review the week. As usual, you're welcome to participate in the conversation. The hashtag is KTN Morning Express, and Trix is at Trixie Gado. I am at Michael G. Tonga. Let's hear what has been a highlight for you.
Absolutely, and of course we get right into it with press review, and joining me for that particular discussion this morning is Lillian Bello, who is a lawyer, as well as Dennis Ntumbi, who's a political risk expert at Adam. Welcome to the show, lady and gent.
Thank you so much.
Now, on this morning, we're having quite a bit of politics taking center stage, and on the Standard, we'll start with that. We're told Ruto, Mudavadi go for Raila jobs, and that has to do with that role of oversight. We're told on the front page, convergence of interest. We do know that the ODM party, Raila Odinga, did have a handshake with the president, and that was to put an end to the hostilities, the political hostilities. And therefore, the argument here is that if he is with the government, he cannot play that role of oversight. I'll start with you, Mr. Ntumbi. What do you make of this particular story?
Thank you very much, and good morning, viewers. And I'm truly delighted to be here. First of all, this is a very, serious matter.
Yes.
To us as a nation, because this is truly what defines democracy. And I usually say that we need to sometimes veer away from political discussions and understand why is it important for the legislature to have an oversight function when it comes to the issue of public finance. And because truly, that is where you perpetuate the doctrine of the separation of powers, and also you get to you get to audit the expenses on how the government is spending their money, especially the cabinet.
Yes.
So if we technically veer back and see the dispatch from the old constitution to the new constitution, is that Wanjiku thought and saw that they did not want an absolute president who practices absolute power and is overbearing. And where public finance cannot be accounted for, nobody can question the presidency and all that. But even though today still there's some gray areas on whether Kenya is a monarchy or not in spirit, but they created the parliament to then administrate the oversight role thereabout. So what has happened currently is that we see as though ODM has taken a disposition as though they are the government. And therefore, a government cannot be able to oversight itself properly.
Yeah.
And I believe, if you look at, the structure of NASA thereabout, it's no longer there. And so that's the reason why ANC is saying, as we seem to be the only ones who do not have an interest in being government. Now, we seem to have an interest in being the opposition. And since it's impossible for government to oversight itself, and technically we're talking about the cabinet where the president sits, the deputy president sits, and then you have the departmental, cabinet administrators as the CSs. It is therefore prudent that in spirit, ANC takes this position so that they'll be able to audit, especially the public finance aspect, whereby they can be able to question spend and appropriate spend properly. Currently, the executive is seen as though it is overbearing towards parliament, and as though parliament and even judiciary is an extension of the executive. So I believe that it is important for the doctrine of oversight, checks and balances to be protected within parliament. And truly, if we love this country and if we want to, strengthen the conversation about democracy and breaking up the further centralization of power between, in the presidency, because if you look at the presidency right now, the president appoints merely everyone, including the Auditor General, completely, judiciary, everyone. So still there's an aspect of a monarchy, and there's a presidency that cannot be oversighted. So if then committees are pro-executive, it means that the only arm of government that is supposed to oversight the executive and is supposed to play as the watchdog of Wanjiku is compromised, and therefore we have a government that nobody knows what it's doing, and it's accountable to none whatsoever.
Absolutely. And on one hand, we see Ayub Sauvula saying that if ODM signs an agreement with Jubilee, then they will officially take over and take over the minority leadership. Once they sign, we will kick them out of NASA and take over. But on the other side, we have here John Buddy saying there is nowhere in the law where chairpersons of committees and their vices are reserved for the majority side. So since the practice has been since 2013 that Jubilee has monopoly, and because they have numbers and pushed through. Lillian, what do you make of that back and forth?
Thank you for having me. We must take recognition of the fact that the 9th March 2018 handshake really shaped the political landscape of this country. Yeah. Kenya is a democracy, and where we have we need to have a vibrant opposition that puts the government into checks and balances, that looks at the excesses of the executive. But what we are seeing is a general consensus when it comes to the agenda of the executive, because when you look at the BBI and the pro-BBI legislators, they have been able to really have a consensus when it comes to the legislative agenda in both houses. Really, the ANC and the legislators that are affiliated to the deputy president can really perform the work of the opposition. But what I'll be questioning is, do they have really the numbers for them to shape the legislative agenda in both houses? Yeah.
Yeah. Now, when you look at the BBI that's upcoming, do you see any hope in the change of structure that Mr. Ntumbi has pointed out that would actually see us function better and that power redistributed, in your opinion?
When you are looking what the BBI is doing in the houses, we are having, a unanimous opinion when it comes to legislative agendas in both houses. So really, we can't say that what it's propagating is the doctrine of separation of powers or checks and balances when it comes to the excesses of the executive. So what we need is really a vibrant, opposition, because Kenya is an ideal democracy, and we need the excesses of the executive put into checks and balances.
Absolutely. Now, far from that, well, not really far, but the Daily Nation is focusing on that as well, but on a different angle. They're focusing squarely on the ANC. We're told ANC gulf widens as lawmakers throw weight behind the president. So, of course, the question is which way, Mudavadi, as has been put on the front page of the Standard. If you want to dig deeper into that, you need to take a look at both the Daily Nation and the Standard. But let's take a look at the front page of the Daily Nation. This morning we're told inside Ruto's plan to beat the system, and they're giving it the elaborate networks of leaders is selling his agenda at the grassroots level. The deputy president is winning hearts through donations to the less fortunate, and of course not necessarily just the less fortunate. Also, he has been reaching out to entrepreneurs, funding those who seem to have bright ideas and throwing his weight behind them. So when you look at that, it seems like he is going after a silent majority. What do you make of this game plan, Mr. Ntumbi?
Indeed, when you look at the desire of the vice president, and way from when he was a minister in charge of education, is that he really went, for the lowly in society. And what he did was review the laws and also the understanding of TVETs, and worked towards, cleaning up TVETs as though the way they were perceived before as schools for failures, and also reduced the weight on the desire for degrees, that everybody wanted to get degrees and acquire degrees thereabout. But then if you look at, the growth of TVETs from about, 30 to now about over 150, he has been very consistent overtime in trying to strengthen, you know, the SMEs, those ones who don't have anything whatsoever. Because if you look at what he's been giving, he hasn't been giving, well, he gave food initially, but technically what you see is that he's trying to enable people who don't have anything to try and do business.
Yes.
And he's been very consistent in ensuring that you know, the worker, the guy at River Road who is importing nuts can be able to produce a segment of those nuts in the country. You know, if you look at technically how his you know, even thematics around the Hustler Nation and all that,
yeah.
He has been trying to get those ones who have no production capacity or capability to be able to produce. And that's sort of the legacy I've seen all the way from his review on TVETs. And by the way, he himself used to go for the graduation of TVETs to try and show parents that this is not a place for losers, but this is a place for the next manufacturers. This is where indeed we can even strengthen the pillar of manufacturing. So I think focusing on strengthening the next generation and the now generation is a better strategy as opposed to strengthening political networks that have already failed, legislators that have failed to deliver anything to this Wanjiku. It is better to go and strengthen Wanjiku because then you will never lose them technically. So if this is a political strategy, at best, this is the best political strategy that needs to be adopted across the board, because once you give somebody a means to produce bread, then you have removed them from sorrow for life. And I think technically, if you look at the pillar, the housing pillar was not a pillar that was supposed to produce houses. The housing pillar was a pillar that was supposed to produce jobs. The ability for us to even manufacture things like nails and nuts and bowls and small little steels and all that. It was not about giving Kenyan every house. It is virtually impossible, even conceptually impossible to try and resolve that.
Yes.
It will take us 50 years. But then, if you look at the aspect of manufacturing, a lot of the pillars will be able to strengthen that. If you look at the crisis that we are in right now, the very fact that there are Kenyans who have benefited from making vitenge masks, and a lot of that. So I think giving Wanjiku the capability and ability to manufacture themselves, giving them these tools of trade, is really empowering a generation that has been disempowered by the same political class for a long time. So this is a genius
approach.
Process.
Now, indeed, he is positioning himself, if the papers are anything to go about, as the hustlers candidate. But then let's take a look at what happened in Kibra, whereby he was on the opposing side and he did throw a bit of his weight on a certain candidate. But at the same time, this did not work. It seems like the Kenyan electorate is quite fickle in their loyalties. Do you think this could be the charm, this long game that he seems to be playing, Lillian?
The deputy president is actually an outsider in his own government.
For sure.
Yeah, when we look at the way he has been perceived to be against the BBI and the recent purge of his allies from key positions in the legislative houses and his silence on the same, we are looking at a man who is really subdued in his own government. Even in a recent funeral of Sergeant Kenei, we saw that the deputy president said that the state bureaucrats were, they were determined to stop his state house bid. So when you really look at all the factors notwithstanding, we are looking at a man who is trying to identify himself with the ground, with the grassroots, because he identifies himself from his humble beginnings as a chicken seller. That is why his famous phrase of Hustler Nation. So when you look at the elections that we had in Kibra, really, we had the BBI versus now the people who are against the BBI. That's why we had some of the Jubilee legislators supporting the ODM candidate. So really, it's not really about. It's not really about ideologies or about the power that the deputy president has, because what we are seeing is really is a man under state capture, and he's really trying to sell his bid to the citizens out there and to associate with the common mwananchi.
Absolutely, but then when you look at his approach, don't you think that the Kenyan electorates need to mature enough to get to a point where we follow ideologies rather than handouts and names, people in certain positions?
Absolutely. So when you look at the Deputy President and his approach, he has changed the approach and is trying to be quiet and fight from within government instead of, getting out of and fighting from the outside. So it's really the Kenyan people to look at more of ideologies rather than, the tribal affiliations, and to look at really the manifestos that can help the Kenyan people.
Right. Now, far from Mr. Ntumbi, you had something to add. Yes.
I think it's important for us to understand that also the Deputy President is the government. He's part of the cabinet. There was a single ticket. There was no ticket called Uhuru Muigai Kenyatta and William Samoei Ruto. It was essentially one ticket.
But we know what has happened since, right?
And also, we need to understand that, quote unquote, what is called the state capture. There are segments of interest. Part one is truly what Kenyans call the dynasties, traditional political families. Part two is the civil service that know, a deep state in the civil service that know, if President Uhuru Kenyatta exits, we also exit. Then there are also characters around the president that will be able to advise him wrongly. So what it is that we are seeing, it is not quite exactly that the Deputy President can be a subdued man, but also the agenda that Jubilee campaigned upon has been hijacked by a few individuals. Because what we've seen, we've seen a dispatch from the Big Four now into BBI. And truly so, BBI can be a sorry excuse for failing to entrench the promises upon which you elected him. And I know for sure that the Deputy President also, a lot of the Big Four, he was a brainchild. And that's the reason why we don't see a lot of this propagation. So it's an arrest of what Wanjiku desired to see. And you need to ask yourself, is that, what will BBI bring to us that the Constitution doesn't bring to us today? What we desire to see is the entrenchment of the Big Four. That is what we desire. That is what we will gauge the presidency upon. That is the legacy that we want the president to leave. It is not BBI. So BBI is a sorry excuse that will never happen in this country. Mark these words and put them in the bank.
You seem very confident about that, but some would argue BBI is the roadmap to the Big Four agenda. Don't you agree?
The Big Four. BBI cannot be a roadmap. In fact, BBI in itself is a tool to excuse those who have failed to deliver their promises to Wanjiku, and also to perpetuate stay in power. There are few people who are threatened that Constitution 2010 expires power. The much you can do is 2 terms. Then after that, you have to hand over the baton. But I would wonder, is the Deputy President selling himself to Wanjiku, or is Wanjiku in love with a man who is in love with them? Well, that's a question that everybody can answer. But I think Wanjiku is desperately in love with a man who is basically trying to empower them.
Lillian, what do you think of that?
Yeah, I think the BBI has actually provided a conducive environment for the enforcement of the Big Four agenda. Because when we looked at after the nullification of the election 2017, we had mobilization of the resist, which some of the Jubilee legislators were saying it is a form of economic sabotage. But when you look at after the handshake and then the BBI, it has produced some form of unity that really the Big Four agenda can develop. So I can say that the BBI really will, even if there's a political issue on it, but it has really provided a conducive environment for the propelment of the Big Four agenda.
A sort of blueprint.
Yes.
Now, let's not argue anymore about that. Let's take a look at another story that has been making headlines the whole week. This has to do with schools. And the Standard this morning is telling us that schools have gone from being gold mines to graveyards of cash. And they're not just looking at this students who are no longer going there because of the coronavirus and the teachers who are unable to earn as usual, especially when you take a look at the private schools. They're also looking at the ripple effects. There are many other industries that feed from the schools. We have transport sectors. We have people who supply, vegetation and, food and what have you. There are people who actually gain from schools in so many ways, but right now they have been rendered without a revenue, a source of revenue, because the schools literally are not there. The students are not going. We took a look at campuses. We have towns that mushroom around campuses. Kakamega town came to life because of Masinde Muliro University a few years ago. So, and when you look at this, and it seems like there was no other plan? Because this came out of nowhere, but then we are suffering. What do you make of what's happening in those institutions and the other sectors that are suffering because universities are no longer operating and the primary schools, secondary schools are not what they used to be? That's to you, Mr. Ndubi.
You've really posited a very, very important question because then we start to see where our economy will suffer. The education sector is a multi-billion-dollar industry because it encompasses the entire scope, you know, of our economy. Because if you look at it, then there's a housing aspect. If you look at it, there's a transport aspect. If you look at it, there's a health aspect. If you look at it, you know, there's the food aspect. So it really encompasses every other sector, you know, of a society. And I believe then other sectors feed from the education sector. Not just that. The education sector itself feeds into the national goals and the goals of education that feed into our developmental plans. So really, if you look at including, by the way, the financial aspect and the banking sector, because you're aware also that students are access loans, students also bank, students also do businesses and thereabout, that you have other manufacturing sectors like now, you know, digital platform and all that, the clothing platform. So the education sector in itself is a huge sector. But today we see that lack of prioritizing this sector, lack of education planning, and a ministry that in itself is defunct and is lacking technocrats has reduced this sector into a mere shell. Our neighbors in Tanzania are back to their feet. They're back in school. I have researched across the board. You know, nations like Cameroon never went through a lockdown. We went through a lockdown here, and the same lockdown, you know, did not put the numbers down. In fact, the numbers kept on going up. So I think we need to see where we put priorities.
Yes.
We have misplaced priorities in this country, whereby we godify politics more than the central pillars of our economy, and education is central to one of them. If you look at basically the number and the sheer size of people that it employs, down from plumbers to cooks, to every other sector, to the security sector, whatever it is that there is, you will see that there's a huge segment of our society that depends on this very pillar. So it's, and also the critical aspect that this country is struggling through the aspect of innovation, that it will still come from the same sector. So we are seeing an incapacitated pillar in this country that is down under now, that needs to be rescued gravely. Also, just to mention a very little bit, which is absolutely critical, we have seen that stopping education, and I always say, education cannot stop. Stopping the education now has made our children over 300% vulnerable. Is that now we have discovered that they are predators in society and all that. We have discovered that a teacher may be more prudent than a parent, one way or the other. So we have seen that even other than the moral pillar, is that there's a huge financial gain that comes from the education sector. And we also in a time where we are transitioning, into new forms of education. So I think there's need to be a very critical review. And even to date, Mr. Mago has not guided the nation forward on what there is. There's a lot of guesswork.
Yes,
that is
but what we're
around.
experiencing is unprecedented. This is not something that any country in the world could have adequately planned for. It hit every nation by surprise, even though others farther along the line compared to the initial ground zero for this particular virus. Now, to put a human face to it, Lillian, last week we had a woman who was locked into her house because she was unable to pay 10,000 shillings in rent arrears. This is because the shop that she was running outside Egerton University was no longer operational because, well, there are no students. So this is just some of the many other people who are suffering, and part of the giving a picture, a much more clearer picture that schools are depended upon by so many. What do you make of this, and what do you foresee happening as we look into a virus that is not even looking like it's letting up?
I think what is showing is the effect of COVID to the economy, and one of the casualties in the economy is the education sector. What we are seeing is actually a disease that we had not foreseen as a country, and we had not prepared really to handle the effects of the same. Yeah, so with the closure of schools, we are seeing so many sectors of the educational sector closing down, and others really suffering, because when you look at the previous school opening and the school opening dates, we used to see an influx in the number of parents who are flogging, for example, bookstores and other institutions to get materials that are recommended by the schools for their children. And we had a sort of monopoly where some of these establishments used to enter into a sort of monopoly with the schools, such that a parent is required to get materials from a certain supplier. But what we are seeing, because of the effect of COVID and the closure of schools still next year, January, we are seeing this a decrease in demand of these equipments, and that is why we are seeing the problems of most of the establishment closing down. But now, when you come to the story of the lady who was supplying food to the university students, that is actually one of the key effects of COVID to the economy, to the small businesses that were thriving because of the population at the universities. So in future, we are seeing a situation where, because now the disease is with us, actually, we are seeing a situation where we need now to diversify in terms of technology. For example, because the disease has taken us to the virtual learning, so we need the diversification and transition now to the e-commerce and now the e-learning, so that now these service providers can be accommodated in the transition.
Absolutely. And speaking of COVID, we're told that 6 counties steer at a possible lockdown owing to the trends. This is coming 2 weeks after we got that reprieve where people were allowed to travel inter-county. What do you think of this possibility, Mr. Nthumbi?
I don't think a lockdown is a solution at all. No. Nations like Cameroon never went through any lockdown, and they're managing less numbers than us. And we went through a lockdown, and what we saw is that the numbers kept on rising. So truly, where is the problem? If we went through lockdown and the numbers kept on escalating, then it means that we need to stop doing the same thing twice. That would be foolishness indeed. What we need to do is look at, first of all, I think we need to reimagine the new normal. And I think truly the solution lies in strengthening our health capacity, our health rendering capacity within the various health institutions. Because one of the things I wonder is that right now, somebody sent me a message yesterday, and they told me that Kenyatta National Hospital is a hotspot for COVID. The hospital itself is transmitting. And I was very shocked. If you look at, Machakos, where we had a hospital that had become an epicenter of the virus, if medics then are incapable of reducing the infection, it means then, our fight towards COVID lies in education. And I believe that educating each one of us and really ensuring that fighting this enemy will take a personal responsibility. I don't think it's about lockdown or anything of the sort. I think truly we must understand how to take care of each other and how to take care of ourselves. Even now, when you go to various places, you'll still see a lot of laxity there about here and there.
Yes.
People have to be, reminded that you need to sanitize. And also it's because I think there's a feeling that this enemy is unseen. And a lot of people have not seen or had one of their colleagues or anything suffer from this. I think we need to bring the reality closer home. We need to train our people and tell them there is COVID and it's dangerous. And also, even though there's a 98% recovery, the other day I read a medical journal and I see that the sort of damage that it leaves you with, your heart, blood vessels and anything of the sort, is something that you may live with for a very long time. So we need to know that this is a dangerous enemy, and as always, you fight an enemy when you have proper knowledge therein. So I think really we need to pump and pump and pump knowledge, and also sell hope, because psychological effect and the economic effect also will tip us now to a mad nation. and we don't want to go
Now,
there.
it's important to note that before we compare ourselves to nations such as Cameroon, we have to look at their testing capacities. We do know that there are people who are silent spreaders of COVID-19. At the same time, when you look at the epicenter, the origin, Wuhan, of the virus, they did enforce these measures, the lockdowns and what have you, to an even quite severe level that, and now they are doing quite much better than the rest of the world. The epicenter moved to another continent. But on that note, let's take a short break. When we come back, we shall have the week in review. Do not go too far. You're watching Morning Express.